Smithson kind of talks about this idea of like contemporary buildings are like they're made kind of like ruins in reverse. They don't necessarily fall into ruin, they kind of rise into ruin before they're even built.
Welcome to The Object Itself, a podcast brought to you by the Albany Institute of History and Art. In each episode, we invite a guest to select one object from our collection or from an exhibition, an object that speaks to them in a unique way. With over 35,000 works in the Albany Institute's permanent collection and over 1 million items in special collections, each piece holds a story, a link to our past, a message for the future. What stories emerge when we devote our full attention to a single object? What contemporary resonances can be found within a 19th century landscape painting, a cast iron stove, a bed frame with feet carved in the shape of dolphins, a painted plaster figurine of Nipper, the RCA Victor dog? In this podcast, we'll delve into the rich histories and personal reflections that our guests bring to the table, revealing how these objects continue to inspire and connect us across time. Whether it's a Hudson River School painting, an antique chair, or an object from everyday life, we'll explore why it matters and what it tells us about our world, past and present. Join us as we take the time to look closer and appreciate the object itself. My guest today is Richard Garrison. Richard's work is informed by close observation of overlooked aspects of daily life within the contemporary American landscape. He transforms subjects such as parking lots, suburban architecture, and advertisements into comparative chart-like abstractions. As he states, quote, "Elements of color, space, and time are distilled into drawn and painted grids that systematically document an intimate interpretation of the ordinary." Richard received his bachelor's in studio art from the College of St. Rose in 1993 and an MFA from Cornell University in 1995. His work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including the Queens Museum, Mass MoCA, the Weatherspoon Art Museum in North Carolina, the Fleming Art Museum in Burlington, and the Albany Institute. In 2002, Richard's work was selected for the Mohawk-Hudson Regional at the Albany Institute, and then the museum acquired a version of the work into our permanent collection. Richard joined me for a conversation about this piece, as well as one other work of art. All right, Rich, thanks for joining me here today on the Object Itself podcast. So before we get started with the works that you've selected, and I have to say, you can always count on artists to sort of break the rules. So the premise of this podcast is pick one object, and immediately you say, "Hey, can I pick two objects?" And
Couldn't resist.
of course, it's the artists who are like, "Let's bend the rules here a little bit," but I love it, and we'll get more into it. But first, I'd love for you to describe more. You grew up in Albany. You grew up coming to the Institute. Could you talk about maybe your early relationship with the museum and how that's evolved?
My first art show outside of like a school was here at the Institute, and I can't remember the exact premise, but it was a history of Albany or historical buildings in Albany kind of show. And I remember doing an ink drawing of the Cathedral of Immaculate Conception over by the plaza. It got into the show. It won a prize, which I was surprised by, because when I look at the drawing, years later, the one of the towers of the cathedral is kind of like leaning to the right a little bit. So
you were a kid, come on.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So, but I remember getting it was a gift certificate to Arlene's Artist Materials, I believe, was the prize, and I ended up buying a set of pastels that I used, for the next 10 years. So it was that was like my first introduction to the Albany Institute.
And I understand you maybe had some private instruction too with maybe artist teachers or tutors that you found through the Institute. Is that right?
I went to Catholic school, and so there was an art program, but it was limited. And so my parents sought out through the Albany Institute a few tutors that I was able to study oil painting through.
you were lucky to have parents who, it sounds like, were always supportive of your artistic ambitions.
They were growing up, going into school, and they still are. They're still very supportive, and they usually are. They're always at my any exhibit that I have. They're my like my constant fan base.
Let's get into the works that you've selected. So I did encourage you to select the work of yours that's in our collection. Could we go ahead and begin by describing this work before we get into the other one?
The piece that's in the collection, it's actually 16 separate works that make up a series called Parking Lot Color Schemes. And it was something that it kind of evolved from, I started teaching color theory at the College of St. Rose and started using color chips when I was with students that I learned from a previous instructor, Laura Canamella. I started using that, and then I had this experience at a Kmart out near Buffalo, where I saw Martha Stewart's everyday color schemes, and the way that they were represented were the color chips that you take, but they were organized differently. Rather than just have like all blues or all yellows on the cards, they were 4 colors that she thought went well together. She kind of provided a formula. So at that time, I didn't know what I was going to. I really liked these ideas of using color, of distilling objects down to the color, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until I was driving getting off the Northway over by Target Northway Mall, and at that time the Northway Mall was demolished, and they were planning to build Target. The Target building wasn't there, but the parking lot was there. They had red lampposts that were there. Everything was painted. The lines were painted, but no building. And so you were elevated off the ramp, and you could see this parking lot, this kind of pristine parking lot. And I kept thinking about how that is like my landscape. I was really interested in landscape, but this is like my contemporary landscape. With that notion, I started, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to try to do something with parking lots, match the colors. And from there, it was, okay, I don't want to match car colors, or I wanted to match kind of like the actual landscape, things that were part of it, that weren't moving. Painted lines, lampposts, mulch or rocks. So, and really influenced. I know Ed Ruscha did a piece years ago where he photographed every building on Sunset Strip, and he also photographed parking lots in LA from the air. But I guess more importantly was Robert Smithson's tour of the monument to Passaic, New Jersey, where he literally took a bus to Passaic, New Jersey, and then went around and photographed things and kind of wrote about things. I didn't know what I was going to find. I knew I was going to find parking lots, but I didn't even like the color variations. I was like, I didn't know what to expect. I thought it was just going to be a lot of grays and blacks and whites and maybe some yellow. And I was really surprised. I think that one of the first ones I went to was a Toys R Us parking lot on Wolf Road, which maybe now is Hobby Lobby. I can't remember, but I remember, seeing like the lampposts were like a faded green. They had, these kind of this yellow for the lines. It started like, well, I was surprised to see the colors. Went to Target, and it had this kind of red, white, and blue palette. I brought like watercolor sets because I wanted to do a screen print project like what I saw with the Martha Stewart. So I just brought these big pad of watercolor paper and matched the colors that I saw in these kind of like these nonchalant brushstrokes, and I labeled things, what they were, so I remembered. And I just did that. And when I made these things, I wasn't really thinking of them as being something that was ever going to be displayed. They were just like a reference point. So when I finished going around to 16 different parking lots in the area, I had to edit what I wanted to screen print in terms of colors, the selection down to like 4 or 5 colors. And so I cut things out, and I made these little collages with more notes, and wrote down what things were and organized them and kind of how I wanted the order to be and the prints that I was going to make. Again, I just made these things not thinking they were going to be, just as a reference point. And a friend of mine used to live in the area, artist George Hoffman. My wife also came in and saw these, and they really liked them. And I was like, well, okay, all right. So I started thinking a little bit differently about what they were. When I showed this at the Albany Institute years ago in the 2002 Mohawk Hudson Regional, I had the printed versions, screen printed versions, and the hand painted versions that are on opposite walls. The juror for the show was Linda Norton, I believe. She, with the Institute, ended up purchasing the hand painted versions, which I was really surprised about because they really just it was like so unplanned in terms of if I probably knew they were going to be displayed, I probably would have been more careful in a way about how I made my brush strokes or how they were organized. If you look at them all, some of them are shorter, some of them are longer, some of them thicker. My handwriting's really rough. It was just meant to kind of be a guide to make these prints. But when you see it all together, the colors, I don't know if you saw it from a distance, if you knew what it would be. You probably have to read the title to figure out what are you looking at. And I think it's when you get up close to it, there's this intimate kind of personal quality of like seeing, like reading the notes of what they were, and then all the little variations, between all the different parking lots. I mean, some of them have some real, like I remember there was Ames out in Glenmont, I believe. I did the parking lot. They had this like dyed red mulch. Crossgates Mall had like really like pastel colors. The Bed Bath and Beyond was so Bed Bath and Beyond in a way. It was all like grays and whites, very soft colors. So it was really surprising, and it was like one of the first things I ever did this way that kind of set the motion for how I still work currently.
And for our listeners too, so each of the 16 studies, they're framed and they're hung in a 4x4 grid. From looking at that layout, you can really see the subtle variations of palette among the different parking lots. And I think the thing I was most surprised by too was how colorful, like how many different really saturated and vivid colors you observed in these studies.
Yeah, that was really surprising. I mean, there is a lot of dull gray and brown colors and whites, but it was really this kind of getting the nuances of what I was after. And I literally, a lot of times now I'll take photographs and work from photographs, but this was all done on site. I drove around to every parking lot, set up, and tried to find, okay, here's the asphalt, here's the mulch, here's the different things that I wanted to observe. And I did them in the spring. It was like April, early May of 2001. So coming up on 25 years, and I'm hoping next year to go around and revisit all these same parking lots to see how they've changed or how they haven't changed.
I mean, that speaks to so many different things like the passage of time, the changing urban, suburban environment. What I found interesting about kind of the origin story of this project too is how it started a little bit with Martha Stewart, which I really love that. Because there's something about just this pervasive, like American culture, American identity, popular culture that pervades through your work. So, juxtaposed against 16 parking lot color schemes, you also selected one other work.
Thomas Cole is somebody who always loved his work. I've always liked his work for the reason of there's this kind of like deeper meaning behind his use of landscape, whether it's morality or whether it's about kind of the change of the environment. This work in particular, it's so dramatic. This Ruined Tower by Thomas Cole, and I know he did multiple paintings of ruins, and this painting, it's just gorgeous. With the sky, that kind of very stormy sky with this kind of sun kind of peeking through it, and then you have this ruined tower over to the far right, which has, it looks like plants or ivy or kind of growing out of it, and the building is really it's like a circular tower. It looks like it's kind of crumbling in a way. It doesn't look very intact. And one of the reasons I chose this was kind of going back to Robert Smithson, where with his tour of the monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, There's one passage in the article where he talks about classical ruins, kind of like buildings kind of falling into ruin. Smithson kind of talks about this idea of like contemporary buildings are like they're made kind of like ruins in reverse. They don't necessarily fall into ruin, they kind of rise into ruin before they're even built. I like that idea a lot, especially like when I was thinking about like the parking lots, because with the Martha Stewart thing, there was something about this kind of ideal, like these four colors that she originally organized that were like this formula. And I was really interested too with this kind of utopian aspect with that with the color matching and this kind of distilling. And so I see parking lots as this kind of utopian thing, and also this thing that's a real warning about what's going on with the landscape and this kind of abuse of the landscape as well. And it's also something that we all live with. And so there's this ideal quality to it, and then there's this very harmful quality related to the parking lots. And I think Cole, he's a little bit more romantic than I am, I think, in what he's doing with his painting. But I think there's something about this painting that's it's kind of like it's this forewarning of something that man built and is kind of like falling back into time, being absorbed back into the landscape.
Do you mind actually reading the Smithson quote because it's so striking?
Sure. This is from a tour of the monuments of Passaic, New Jersey from 1971. And the quote here is, "That zero panorama seemed to contain ruins in reverse. That is, all the new construction that would eventually be built. This is the opposite of the romantic ruin, because the buildings don't fall into ruin after they are built, but rather rise into ruin before they are built."
So the work that we're looking at, it's Thomas Cole's Ruined Tower, Mediterranean Coast Scene with Tower from 1832 to 1836. That's on view in the Hudson River School Gallery at the Albany Institute. I'm really interested in putting these two works next to each other. Do you consider yourself, has anyone called you, or do you call yourself a Hudson River School painter?
No, I don't.
Not capital, letter
Yeah.
version, but you know what I mean.
I see it maybe like a thread, a connection between what I did with the parking lots and what Cole was doing possibly.
Could we talk about one other influence just because he's a personal favorite of mine, Robert Gober? What in his practice that really strikes you or resonates with you?
Well, Robert Gober, I think, was somebody that really influenced me early on in school, and it was primarily because of his use of installation. I was working with a lot of installations at the time. As I got out, installations were just becoming a little too much to kind of keep sustaining. So I was trying to think of working a way that would become, because every time I did an installation, things would kind of have to be destroyed afterwards. And so I wanted to create something that was possibly like a 2D installation, something that didn't have to be destroyed, that could possibly be reshown. And so Gober, in a way, what I really liked about Gober's work was that he had this handcrafted quality to everything he does and still does. And there's also this very personal aspect to what he does as well. And when he already had an exhibit, you would have a variety of multimedia kind of things. Like he'd have things made out of plaster that he painted. He'd print wallpaper, all kinds of stuff. And they would all somehow have this like relationship. They'd have this dialogue that would create this larger meaning going on. There was this comparative element. And I think like with the parking lots, it's like seeing just one of them, one of the actual parking lots is okay, but seeing the 16 of them, when you start comparing the colors, you see, how different they are. There's kind of something that kind of builds up, and it hopefully, I don't want there to be like a one meaning that's coming out of it, but hopefully there's this kind of thing that comes out by you start comparing the things yourself and you come to your own conclusions. And I think that's with a lot how like Gober worked as well.
And I guess just to close out, I have an agenda here with selecting one work to talk about for an entire episode. Do you want to speak a little bit to, just in your opinion, the importance of spending time with art, sustained looking and observation? Obviously, that's a huge part of your process, and being with your subject is a big part of your process. But what about spending time with art?
Oh, it's so important. And even like during COVID time, I didn't get out as much as I wanted to see art. And you had to kind of live off the internet to some degree. And getting back to seeing things in person, it's amazing. I've been doing this for so long, and it still amazes me like how much of a surprise you get from seeing the works in person. I teach a two-dimensional design class, and they have to do an observational study where they have to compare two works. It's required they have to go in person to see the things. Spend time with them, take notes, possibly even do some drawings of them. Because I think even drawing it, you can kind of see more than just kind of looking at it. It forces you to spend more time with it. So it's really important. And going up into that collection of the Hudson River School paintings here at the Institute, you're just amazed by when you go around and you see the variety, and you see like I still never get enough of looking at like the church paintings, looking at Duran paintings as well, and the variety that's going on. And even with this coal painting, like before we started, I really wanted to come and like look at it and really know it. And the color of this painting is it's just amazing. It's vibrant in the photo, but it's even more vibrant when you see it in person.
Do you have anything coming up that you want to plug? I know we can look forward to 25 years later of the parking lot series. Anything else?
Just currently, I think right now I'm included in an exhibit I believe it's called the Art of Pattern over at the Pine Hills Library in Albany, and that's through the Opalka Gallery, and I think that runs until the beginning of May.
Excellent. We'll definitely get this up before then.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Rich, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
You can see Richard's work in the exhibition Repeat Play, The Art of Pattern, which was organized by the Opalka Gallery and now on view at the Albany Public Library, Pine Hills branch through May 10th. You can also see the Thomas Cole painting we discussed at the Albany Institute, where we have one of the largest collections of Hudson River School paintings on view in a long-term exhibition. That's all for this episode, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of The Object Itself.